I am Lauren Summers. I'm Senior Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel at the Yale Alumni Association. And I'm delighted to bring you this final presentation from Yale Alumni Academy for this year. And it is entitled How Islam Shaped the Life of Christopher Columbus, with Alan Mikhail, who is Professor of History and Chair for the Department of History at Yale. Professor Mikhail is widely recognized for his work in Middle Eastern and global history. He is the author of 4 books and over 30 scholarly articles that have received multiple awards in the fields of Middle Eastern and environmental history, including awards from the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association for Under Osman's Tree, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and environmental history. And he's received the Roger Owen Book Award of the Middle East Studies Association for Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt and environmental history. His latest book is God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire and the Making of the Modern World. In 2018, he received the Annalisa Meyer Research Award of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for internationally distinguished humanities scholars and social scientists. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And please join me in welcoming Professor Mikhail to our presentation this afternoon. He's going to get us started in just a minute. Before that, I'll just share a few rules of the road for our lecture today. If you have questions, please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be getting to questions at the end of the presentation. If you have comments or thoughts that you would like to share as the presentation goes on, please feel free to put those in the chat. But when it comes time for questions, I will only be reading the questions that come out of the Q&A box. And other than that, I think we're ready. So Professor Mikhail, take us away to the Ottoman Empire.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, maybe, good evening. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, happy holidays all around. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I'm really looking forward to our time together. I look forward to our discussion after my talk. So as Lauren said, I just finished a book. And that book was about the Ottoman Empire and world history. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen here to show you a short presentation that I've put together. Okay, good. So this quote we'll get to in a second. This is the book that I just finished that Lauren mentioned. And one of the things I became very interested in working on this book is the rivalry between the Ottoman Empire and Spain in the early modern period, in the decades around 1500, a very pivotal moment in world history. And that's how I came to the topic of the talk today about Columbus, obviously. The initial sort of clues that laid the seeds for this talk, I came to in the classroom at Yale. Specifically, I was teaching a course on the history of the world around the year 1500 with a colleague of mine. And we read Columbus's journals. And there I began noticing some very odd resemblances that Columbus, and I would come to learn many of that first generation of conquistadors, the resemblances they drew between Islam and the Americas. So I want to just begin with some of these observations since this was my entry point into this material. So for example, Columbus calls the weapons of the indigenous Taíno of the Caribbean el fanjes, which is a Spanish word derived from an Arabic word for a curved metal sword inscribed with Quranic verses that was commonly used by Muslims in Iberia and in North Africa. Now, this is despite the fact that Columbus himself tells us that the Taíno, quote, have no iron, and of course, they knew nothing of the Quran. But he nevertheless likens these Taíno to Muslim soldiers by putting alfanjes in their hands. Later, when Columbus sees the scarves of a group of indigenous women, he thought they were related through some form of Eurasian trade or contact to what he termed Moorish sashes, that is Muslim sashes. A couple decades later, Cortez will write that the Aztecs of Mexico similarly wore what he called Moorish robes. And again, that Aztec women resembled Moorish women. Aztec dancing, Cortez thought, was somehow related to the dances of the Moors in Spain. Cortez is particularly fruitful for this sort of thing. He has many comparisons between the Aztecs and the Islamic civilizations that he and other Spaniards had fought against in the Old World. In the Aztecs, Cortez and his men met a formidable, complex empire with enormous cities, a highly sophisticated political culture, and imposing armies. More than the Taino, for example, in the Caribbean, the Spanish saw in the Aztecs, in what is today Mexico, a rival enemy civilization akin to the Muslim empires of the Old World. So, for example, Cortez writes in his diary of the conquest of Mexico that he saw over 400 mosques, mezquitas. He calls Montezuma a sultan. He describes Montezuma's palaces in terms strikingly similar to those of Granada, of the Muslim kingdoms of Granada. These are things that would continue long after the period of Columbus and Cortez. Over the course of the 16th century, for example, the Spanish tried to subdue and Christianize the Chichimecas of Mexico, whom they consistently referred to as al-Arabes, the Arabs. In Brazil in the 16th century, the children of Portuguese men and indigenous women were called el Mamelucos, the Mamluk Empire based in Cairo. Plains Indians captured and transported by the Spanish as slaves to New Mexico were often known as Jenisarios, a corruption of the Turkish word for janissary, Yeniçeri. The Spanish named a large city in the Yucatan after Cairo. And if we come closer to the present, we'll also see that on the border of Mexico and the United States today, there is a city named Matamoros, Moor Slayer. Matar meaning to kill, Moros being the Spanish word for Moors. And we could provide many other examples of this sort of thing, even stretching into the 18th century and the founding of the United States. So again, these kinds of flashes of equivalences that these early Spanish conquistadors drew in the New World between the indigenous civilizations of the Caribbean and Mexico with the Muslim world were some of my starting points for thinking about this topic. And at one level, we might say, well, there's nothing very surprising about this. The Spanish conquistadors were forged in an old world crucible of Christian and Muslim warfare. Many of them had fought against the Muslim kingdoms in southern Spain and North Africa. Many had sailed along the West African coast, where they also encountered Muslims. So in a new place in the New World, fighting against new enemies, they fell back on what they knew, something that all of us, of course, do. John Eliot, one of the foremost historians of Cortez, writes about this phenomenon the following. Quote, since the only political model for conquest Cortez knew was the Reconquista in Spain, Montezuma therefore had to be treated in his narrative as a Muslim ruler would have been. Anahuac in Mexico is thus described, as far as Cortez is able, in images more appropriate to Assyria or Persia, or more closer to home to Granada than any possible American Indian society. End quote. At another level, though, the sparks of Islam in the historical record of the early Spanish colonial Caribbean offer us numerous ways of conceiving of the place of Islam in the early modern world. and also of seeing the history of the Americas in a new way. And this is what I want to explore with you some today. And to focus my discussion, I'm limiting myself to Columbus to make my points. He's perhaps an all too easy stand-in for the earliest interactions between the Old World Muslim Catholic encounter and the Caribbean. My wager, though, is that by understanding Columbus as a man formed by his historical period, formed by Islam, that we will come to understand how these examples of the Islam with which I opened today helped to form the early periods of European colonization in the New World. So when I'm speaking about Columbus, I'm really using him as an exemplar of this first generation of Spaniards. It's worth noting that in the vast scholarship on Columbus's life, the central role of Islam has been given relatively short shrift, while the major elements of his biography have been well known now for over centuries. And while indeed historians have made passing reference to his moments of interaction with the Muslim world, with Muslims in Iberia, in West Africa, etc., no historian has really focused on this crucial aspect of the Columbus biography. And this is what I want to do today. I hope that in this talk, I'll be able to make Columbus look a bit strange, once again, this figure with whom we're all so familiar. So let's begin then where Columbus began, namely in Genoa, the city of his birth. He was born in Genoa in 1451. Even in this small neighborhood, in Genoa that he shared with his parents and his 4 siblings, we can see that there was a kind of shadow presence of Islam. Columbus spent most of his first 2 decades in the city. At the age of 9, in between lessons in mathematics, navigation, and accounting, Columbus would have rushed down to the docks to bid farewell to fleets of crusaders who were leaving the city for Jerusalem. Genoa was a magnet for crusaders in this period, in the second half of the 15th century, because of the strong presence of the Knights of St. John, who offered free housing and medical care to crusaders. Columbus's family, many historians think, personally knew some crusaders, and no doubt the boy Columbus grew up hearing of some of their tales of distant lands and of far-off enemies. It's important to note that Columbus was born just 2 years before the fateful year of 1453, when Mehmet the Conqueror, the Ottoman Sultan, won Constantinople for the Ottoman Empire. This is the very famous Bellini painting of Mehmet the Conqueror, Mehmet II. More than any other event, 1453 shaped the contours of Columbus's and his generation's geopolitical lives. As one of the popes wrote of the loss of Constantinople, it was the plucking out of one of the eyes of Christianity. Constant calls for crusade after 1453 against the Ottomans' military advances didn't lead to very much in the 15th century. In the second half of the 15th century, Columbus's age was mostly one of European weakness in the face of the rising ascendancy of the Ottoman Empire. Still in Genoa, in the city's San Lorenzo Cathedral, Columbus would have gone to Mass every week. This church held important treasures supposedly captured during an earlier crusade, an emerald green bowl said to be the dish Jesus washed his hands in before the Last Supper, and a silver reliquary purported to contain the ashes of John the Baptist. These sorts of trophies of conquest from earlier crusading missions were sprinkled all over Europe, from small towns to large cathedrals. They brought the civilizational clash between Islam and Christendom into nearly every European neighborhood church, amulets of this military conflict with the East. In between Sundays at San Lorenzo, Columbus would have learned about other Europeans, not just crusaders, who traveled to the Muslim world. Even though it was a vital crusader entrepot, Genoa was above all a mercantile port, not a military one. Over the centuries, Genoese merchants prospered in cities like Beirut, Alexandria, Tunis, Algiers, all along the eastern coast of the Black Sea, and in cities across Europe, in Naples, Paris, Bristol, etc. Sometimes these Genoese traders even exercised something akin to direct political control in some of these cities, especially in some of the ports in the Black Sea. So Genoa maintained some very old connections to ports and towns that would steadily be incorporated into the Ottoman Empire over the course of the 14th and the 15th centuries, adding to the anxiety of Genoa's merchant community at these losses to the Ottomans in the Black Sea and in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. In addition to breathing in the mercantile air all around him in Genoa, Columbus learned important lessons about the East by reading the works of important Italian writers, and one in specific was quite formative for his ideas about the East, and that is, of course, Marco Polo, who happened to travel through the city of Trabzon, here on the southeast coast of the Black Sea, when it was a thriving Genoese colony. Reading the tales of Marco Polo and other accounts of travel to distant lands formed much of the mental canvas of Columbus in his youth. One of the most important things Columbus learned from Marco Polo was the existence of a figure known as the Grand Khan, who lived somewhere off in the Far East. Marco had supposedly arrived in the opulent court of the Grand Khan, past Constantinople, past Jerusalem, past Baghdad. There he discovered a jewel-encrusted paradise of luxury, learning, and power. What most interested Columbus and other Europeans about the Grand Khan was precisely that he was not a Christian, but according to Marco Polo, very much wanted to be one. So although he had achieved the heights of civilization without the benefits of Christianity, the Grand Khan seemed to understand the truth of the religion and might even convert himself, thereby gaining for Christianity the souls of all his subjects. This fantasy of the Grand Khan lit many European imaginations ablaze. For Christians, he offered the perfect mirror of everything Islam should have been, but wasn't. A civilization, no doubt, one formed outside of the realm of Christianity, but one that recognized its own bankruptcy in the face of the glories of Christianity. So the Grand Khan was not yet a Christian, but according to the fantasy, always about to be one. Moreover, once he entered the faith, the Muslims of the Middle East, in possession of Jerusalem, would then be surrounded by Christians in Europe and then in Asia, who in one final apocalyptic pincer move would destroy Islam and forever retake the holy city of Jerusalem. So after centuries of failed crusades, with the spectacular growth of the Ottoman Empire and also of the Mamluk Empire, Europe looked with anticipation to a figure like the Grand Khan, thousands of miles away in Asia. There are many other stories about the religious conflict between Christianity and Islam that Columbus was exposed to in his youth. For example, the legend of what are termed the 7 cities of Cibola that suggested to Columbus the existence of large amounts of gold far off in the Dark Sea. Filled with these and other fantasies and raised on accounts of the Crusades, Columbus's interactions with Islam deepened during his teenage years when he took to the Mediterranean as an apprentice sailor, embarking on some of the first maritime voyages of his life at the age of 13 or 14. As a merchant's assistant on board, he would have packed merchandise, recorded weights and costs, secured lodgings in port for captain and crew, and generally been available to deal with navigational and business matters. He built a reputation for himself as a hardworking and reliable sailor for hire, and found opportunities for work with the merchant and mercenary expeditions employed by European powers in this period. Some of these journeys took him to the shores of the Muslim world. So before the Atlantic voyages across the ocean, we're used to seeing maps such as this one that describe Columbus's maritime career before he reached the Americas, that he sailed from Iberia to some of the islands of the Eastern Atlantic, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, that he sailed up to London and Ireland. But the point that I want to make is that he has an entire Mediterranean sailing career ever before he leaves the Straits of Gibraltar. And this is something that hasn't been studied as much as his later career, but is obviously important for us to understand his interactions with the Muslim world. So for example, in 1472, at the age of 21, Columbus had his first documented encounter with the Muslim world. He had taken a job as a mercenary soldier for the King of Anjou during a war to capture Naples. Over the course of this fighting, one of the King of Anjou's ships was captured by North African corsairs, North African pirates, and commandeered south to the North African coast. The king dispatched Columbus to sail south to retrieve his ship. Columbus sails to the city of Tunis. Tunis in those years was the stronghold of the Hafsid Empire that ruled along the North African coast, making its money from piracy and also the overland caravan trade of North Africa. Like many city-states around the Mediterranean, it had made a lot of money from these sorts of activities and was a center of art and culture. Intrepid youth that he was, Columbus excitedly sailed with his more apprehensive crew from Naples, first west to Sardinia, and then turned south to the North African coast. The outcome of this venture, did he get the ship or not, is unfortunately not known. Despite the uncertainties, though, in the historical record, this earliest encounter with the world of Islam brought Columbus face to face for the very first time with the enemy civilization that he had only learned about in church and by reading texts during his youth. He experienced firsthand the naval power of the rulers of Tunis, who were able to capture a ship from the King of Anjou. He saw for himself and later writes about the fear in his crew's eyes when they realized they would have to sail into Muslim territory in the south. Sailing to Tunis in his early 20s thus allowed him to test some of the mythologies of his childhood against reality, confirming some of the truths of the Muslim world. He would gain closer and deeper firsthand experience of the Muslim world a couple of years later, when in 1475, a branch of the Spinola firm in Genoa sent him to the island of Chios, the hilly, mostly scrub vegetation island in the Aegean Sea, just off the Anatolian coast. Chios in these years, and before and after, was quite famous for mastic, which was produced naturally in the sap of trees. And Chios is the only place on Earth where this mastic is produced naturally. So the Spinola firm had sent him there to try to collect some of the mastic. After Genoa lost some of its major trading ports in the Black Sea, Chios had become the Italian city-state's easternmost territory and was therefore of vital importance to its commercial and strategic interests in trading with the Ottoman Empire and other points east. In traveling to Chios, Columbus was exposed for the very first time to the Ottoman Empire. And although Chios was still a Genoese colony, the island was very much now in the orbit of the Ottomans. They ruled the blue seas around the island, the ports on the Anatolian shore just across from Chios. They had captured many of the islands around Chios in the decades before, places like Limnos, Ibros, Lesbos, Samothrace, etc. And Columbus was regaled in Chios with tales of the loss of territory to the Ottoman Empire in the Black Sea and in the Aegean. He also heard about the loss of Constantinople a few decades before. And this loss was particularly fresh in the minds of people on Chios. Genoese reinforcements were sent from Chios in the defense of Constantinople against the Ottomans. And many families on the island had lost soldiers during this battle, and therefore these losses were still fresh for many individuals on the island of Chios. So the stories Columbus learned in his youth of Christianity's existential battle with Islam were suddenly brought to life for him in a place like Chios, where he heard about the loss of a Christian city to Muslim hands. On this eastern frontier of Christendom, he witnessed for the very first time the awesome power of the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest Muslim states of the period. He saw that it surrounded a very tiny place like Chios. The tales he heard about the losses of other Genoese ports in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean helped him to understand this notion that Christianity was in the retreat, and that it needed some sort of drastic offensive measure to try to face down this rising power of Islam in the East. After his time in the employ of the Spinola firm of Genoa, Columbus eventually makes his way to Portugal, and he falls in with a group of explorers associated with the Portuguese prince known as Henry the Navigator. Like all ambitious Europeans, the adventurers that Columbus joined in Portugal were looking for ways around the Muslim world, how to access the lucrative markets of the East without having to pass through the territories of the Mamluk Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which excised massive tariffs and even would often harass some of these merchants. These men believed in the truth of crusade and holy war, and like Columbus, believed in the existence of a grand Khan who would help them to attack Islam from the East. Many of them were quite explicit in defining their expeditions in religious terms as part of a global war between Christianity and Islam. So for example, Henry the Navigator himself grew up with this crusading civilizational battle baked into his daily bread. One of his contemporaries writing about Henry notes the following, quote, Henry was actuated by the zeal for God, by the desire for alliance with the Eastern Christians of the Grand Khan, by an eagerness to know just how far the power of the infidel existed, by the wish to convert people to Christianity, and by the desire to fight the Moors, end quote. Henry's most famous plan to outflank the Muslims in the Mediterranean rested on his belief in the possibility of a southern route around Africa. Thus, to his utter dismay, when he, working his way down the West African coast, discovered that Islam was already flourishing in West Africa in places he never even knew existed. When the Portuguese arrived in West Africa, Islam had grown from a minority faith of a few adherents to the state religion of several West African empires, most prominent among them the Mali Empire, which had adopted Islam as its official religion in 1324. In the 15th century, when Henry is navigating down this coast, the presence of Muslims in West Africa further deepened this sense among European Christian crusaders that their faith was somehow surrounded by this powerful force of Islam. Henry died in 1460. The team of men that he built would continue his project in West Africa, sailing further and further down the West African coast. The furthest point south that they reached in this period was the city of São Jorge de Mina, this city known as Elmina today in Ghana. This city would soon prove the linchpin of Portugal's empire in West Africa, a key conduit first from funneling gold, and then of course slaves from West Africa to Lisbon and elsewhere. In 1481, Portugal's new king, João II, resolved that his kingdom needed a stronger presence on the Gulf of Guinea to protect its growing economic stakes in the gold trade. And so he dispatched a heavily armed fleet to build the fortified trading post that you see here in the city of São Jorge de Mina, the first ever European-built structure in sub-Saharan Africa that would later become an important site for the dispatching of enslaved Africans across the ocean. In the 1480s, though, when it was built, João sent foundation stones, roof tiles, nails, and other provisions on 12 ships from Lisbon to São Jorge de Mina. And Columbus himself, now 31, was on one of these ships. While he was there in São Jorge de Mina, Columbus brought together 3 pieces of information that helped to concretize the idea that he had been working on for several years now. Namely, that if he would head west across the Atlantic, he would find Asia and maybe even the Grand Khan. In West Africa, he found seemingly endless supplies of precious gold. This would come to be known as the Gold Coast, of course. Contemporary understandings of geography taught Columbus that regions at the same latitude enjoyed similar climates and natural features. In his understanding then, if he headed directly due west from Elmina, he would find lands rich in gold. Hitting upon these treasures was very important to be able to build the army needed for the conquest of Jerusalem. In addition to this information about gold, Columbus learned in Elmina that Asia was close. Sailors in the African port told him of logs that would regularly wash up on the coast that seemed to have been worked by human hands. Columbus took this as evidence that the lands across the ocean from whence he was convinced this carved wood came could not have been too far away. The last piece of information that Columbus learned while in Elmina had to do with the Atlantic's ocean currents. On the west coast of Africa, the prevailing currents blow out to sea, and this was the exact opposite of the situation off the Iberian coast, where the ocean's eastward currents made it difficult to sail west for much of the year. So to head west from Iberia, Columbus learned that it was best to first sail south to catch the westerly current across the ocean. So from São Jorge de Mina, Columbus returns to Portugal, confident that he now has most of the information needed to execute his plan to sail around the Muslim world and to find the Grand Khan. What he needed now, of course, was a patron. And the story of Columbus's back and forth negotiations between different European sovereigns, Spanish, French, Portuguese, English, Venetians, Genoese, is a quite well-known story that I won't get into too much here. What I want to focus on is the less well-known aspects of the role that Muslims played in this affair of Columbus seeking a patron. His major push for the money he needed to fund his venture into the Atlantic occurred in the second half of the 1480s. This was the same decade in which his eventual financiers, Isabella and Ferdinand, had declared war on Islam in Iberia. And it's not a coincidence that the Spanish Reconquista and Columbus's voyages occurred at nearly exactly the same time. In Columbus's mind, in the Spanish sovereigns' minds, the two were pieces of the same global war of Christianity against Islam. And as part of this global strategy against Islam, the Spanish moved their navies east in the Mediterranean against the encroachments of the Ottomans and the Mamluks. They endeavored to push all of Iberia's Muslims off the peninsula, and they would eventually send Columbus off to the west, to Asia, to try to surround the Muslims of the Middle East. So let's take each of those in turn. Ottoman advances in the second half of the 15th century directly impacted Spanish holdings in the Mediterranean. After Mehmed the Conqueror of Constantinople, the figure that I showed you before, after his conquest of Constantinople, he also conquered the walled port city on the very tip of the heel of the boot of Italy, this city here, Otranto, in the year 1480. From Otranto, he sent ships to Sicily, the largest of the Mediterranean's islands, to assess a possible invasion of that island. Sicily, once a Muslim possession, of course, was in the 15th century nominally under the sovereignty of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And so a threatening move by the Ottoman Sultan demanded the Spanish queen and king's attention. Ottoman rule over the island of Sicily would have solidified their control over the Eastern Mediterranean and given them an important launching pad for invasions further west in the sea, a danger that no European sovereign could stomach. One of Isabella's court historians of this period wrote, quote, "Every day news came to the king and queen that the Turks had a great armada on the sea and that they were sending it to conquer the kingdom of Sicily." The Spanish sovereigns therefore leapt into action after Mehmet's exploratory fleet was spotted off of Sicily's rocky coast. Luckily for Spain, Mehmet died the very next year in 1481, and the subsequent Ottoman succession crisis forced the empire to give up on Sicily and indeed to give up on Otranto. And this was the only time for less than a year that the Ottomans held territory on the Italian peninsula. Despite this retreat, over the course of the 1480s, the Ottomans would continue to push west in the Mediterranean. Mehmet's successor was his son Bayezid, and in 1488, Bayezid attacked the island of Malta. This prompted Spain to send further reinforcements to strengthen its garrisons in Sicily, again, Malta being very close to the southern coast of Sicily. Between 1487 and the middle of the 1490s, Ottoman ships continued making landings even further west in the Mediterranean, reaching places like Corsica, Pisa, the Balearic Islands, all along the North African coast as well, in places like Algiers and Oran. And although these were not full-scale military invasions that resulted in permanent Ottoman holdings, the sight of fleets of Ottoman ships forcibly pulling into ports in the Western Mediterranean panicked already frightened European states, most especially Spain, which had many colonial holdings in the Western Mediterranean. Muslim gains in the sea immediately made the already precarious situation of Spain's own Muslims much more dire. Internal Muslims eventually became lumped with with Spain's external Muslim enemies. Columbus, Henry, the Pope, all of them thought that they were warring against Islam wherever it existed, whether at home or abroad. And as leader of one of the largest and most influential Christian states, Isabella especially saw it as her duty to crusade against Muslims. Within Iberia, there were Muslims living both under Spanish Christian rule and also independent Muslim states in the south. And both were liable to be allies of the Ottomans and the Mamluks. So given the territorial expansion of the Ottomans in the 1480s and the 1490s, given the presence of Muslims in Iberia, Isabella and Ferdinand saw their reconquista in the south of the peninsula, their battle against the Muslim kingdoms of the south, as a process both of consolidation on the Iberian Peninsula itself, but also a piece of a larger global civilizational battle. Steeped as he was his entire life in the rhetoric and reality of the Crusades, Columbus used his belief in the notion of war between Christendom and Islam to push his case for the Atlantic voyages with Isabella and Ferdinand. If he could show them that heading west across the ocean would be a piece of the effort to defeat Islam, then he believed that they would finance his journey. Columbus found it very difficult to gain any traction for this idea with the king and queen. They were way too busy in the late 1480s to pay any attention to him. Strapped for cash, without any viable patronage options, Columbus joined Spanish armies against the Moors in the south. In these years, in the late 1480s, the Reconquista was on the front foot, winning battle after battle in the south around the most important city of the south, Granada. The surrender of the Muslims of Granada occurred on January 2nd, 1492. With the defeat of this last of the Muslim kingdoms of southern Spain, this brought to a close nearly 7 centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. For Christians everywhere, Granada represented an enormous victory. Jubilant church bells rang out across European cities. The Pope ordered days of festivities. Celebratory bullfights were organized across Spain. Mock reenactments of the siege of Granada were played out to relive the joyous defeat of Islam. Coming just a few decades after the loss of Constantinople, Granada for many was seen as an act of retribution, a Christian answer to the Muslim victory at Constantinople. In the words of one Spanish court historian, the conquest of Granada, quote, was famed and celebrated through all the realms of Christendom, and it extended to the farthest and most remote lands of the Turk and the Sultan. After the fall of Granada, Isabella, against the judgment of her advisors, against the judgment of her husband, emboldened by her victories in the south, agreed to fund Columbus to cross the Atlantic. She had just vanquished Spain's Muslims, a first step in the annihilation of Christianity's ultimate enemy. Christ might finally march upon the entire world. Jerusalem would be won. If Columbus's plan, risky and far-fetched though it was, could contribute even in a minor way to Christian Europe's total destruction of Islam, then it would have proven a worthy investment of her resources. The opening lines of Columbus's logbook of his first foray across the Atlantic make plain that he understood his voyage, as Isabella did, as a new crusade, as the latest salvo in centuries of war between Christianity and Islam. And this is the very first passage of his journal. In the space of just a single sentence, Columbus pivots from Spain's Reconquista, defeat of Islam in the south, to finding and converting the Grand Khan that Marco Polo had promised would help him to surround Islam. The extension of Spain's civilizational religious crusade is what sent Columbus off across the Atlantic. Winning Jerusalem was always his goal, and he could only assimilate the New World through his millennial understanding of the Old World, that Islam and Christianity were at war. From Columbus's early days in Genoa, where he waved good tidings to crusaders sailing off to fight Muslims, to his experiences with the Portuguese enslavement of Muslims and others in West Africa, to the very moment before he left Europe in Granada, Columbus's life was formed in and against Islam. And this is why, once in the Americas, where Islam so very clearly did not exist, Columbus nevertheless saw it there too. And this brings us back then to the examples with which I started. Grasping for some sort of framework through which to reconcile all of the difference and newness of the Americas, Columbus and other Europeans turned to the most extreme version of otherness available to them, Islam. As arresting as it is, the Spanish increasingly stretched the analytical limits of their late 15th century universe to understand the indigenous people of the Americas as somehow related to Muslims, that Taino women somehow have something to do with Moorish women. This is in part why I think the biography of Columbus that I've shared with you today matters. The crucible of the Crusades, centuries of warfare between Christendom and Islam, the encroachment of the Ottomans west in the years after 1453, all of this forged in the minds of Columbus, Cortez, and the thousands of other Europeans who fought Muslims in the Old World, that their enemies were first and foremost Muslims, and they took this with them on the other side of the ocean. All their lives, they had learned that the notion of enemy nearly always equaled Muslim. This was their set standard category of difference, and they used this understanding to help to grasp the indigenous cultures that they encountered in the Americas. Understanding this continuity of the culture of Islam and how it shaped this generation of conquistadors helps us to see that 1492 was not the break it's often portrayed to be. 1492, the beginning of the modern world for some, the end of the independent sovereignty of the Americas for others, Columbus, the first Italian American, or the progenitor of a continental genocide. To properly and fully understand 1492, we have to understand the continuities that made and shaped it. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic were a direct result of Muslim-Christian animosities in the Mediterranean, and Columbus and his men took this long history of war with Islam across the Atlantic with them. Many of those who went to America had fought against Muslims in Granada and in North Africa. Some of them would even return from the Americas after fighting Muslims in the Old World first, and then the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and Mexico would return to the Old World to fight again against Muslims. So Cortez, for example, waged the very last battle of his life in Algiers, having first fought Muslims in the Old World, then against the Aztecs, and then fighting again in Algiers at the end of his life. As one of the earliest 16th century Spanish historians of the Americas wrote, quote, "The conquest of the Indians began after that of the Moors was completed, so the Spaniards would ever fight the infidels." So the category of infidel encompassing both Native Americans and Muslims. Islam helped to push the Crusades to the Caribbean, and even on the other side of the Atlantic, Europe's enemies somehow remained Muslims. In the narrative of 1492 as break, Islam is always portrayed as being of the Old World, part of all that was left behind for a new beginning in a new world. And it's precisely because Islam was so central to the history of Europe in the Old World that it's been excised from the histories of Europe in the New World. And we historians have in many ways followed the lead of many of the Europeans who went to the Americas, those who sought to relegate Islam to the past in favor of a future free of this old world menace. Indeed, beginning just a few decades after Columbus and continuing for centuries after that, Europeans feared the transfer of Islam to the Americas. Trying to keep Islam out of the New World thus also meant keeping Islam largely out of the narratives of the making of the modern world after 1492. If the Atlantic voyages are so crucial to the history of the world after 1500, and I would agree that they are, and if Islam is removed from this story, then Islam is never seen as foundational, additive, or even relevant to modern history. It stands apart. It's a part of the past, appearing only every now and then as an enemy on the outside. Leaving out the story of Islam and the shaping of Columbus removes it from this early history of the European colonization of the Americas. It prevents us from seeing the integral role that Islam played in the formation of both Columbus and in the early years of Spanish rule in the Americas. If, however, as I've tried to do today, we accept that Islam is part of one of the oldest cultural tropes in the New World, as long as the history of European colonialism and disease, if we accept that Islam was the mold that cast the history of European racial and ethnic thinking in the Americas, as well as the history of warfare in the Western Hemisphere, then Islam has a role to play in any understanding of the history of the Americas, and also, quite regrettably, of the history of Native peoples in the Americas. After 1492, European colonialism folded the Americas and its native peoples into the long history of European Islamic relations. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Mikhail. Wow, that was a dense and fascinating presentation. I'm amazed at how much history you got in such a short period of time. And I know that we have already about 20 questions that have come in. So we're not going to force you to play 20 questions. We're going to actually ask you to play more than 20 questions, because I think we'll have more coming in as we talk. I guess I would just kick it off by saying what struck me listening to your presentation is the contemporary perspective of the rise of Islamicism globally, and all the different sort of political variants of how that plays out in our sort of new global narrative, and how few people know this history. So the Islamic world knows that at one point Islam sort of ruled vast swaths of what is now European territory, but the Western world doesn't. And I found it really fascinating how your presentation brought that to light for us, because it connects the times that we're living in today with, with this history of the founding of the Americas, as well as, the times going before that. So for me, that was just what was really profound about placing your presentation in the context of a lot of conversations that happen on a daily basis in our society now. I will encourage all of you, if you have questions, please can you place your questions in the Q&A box. The Q&A box allows me to see the order that the questions come in. If you place your questions in the chat, it's very likely that I will miss them. And I'm going to get through as many questions as I can, going back to the first one, the first ones to come in, and just going up to whatever we have time for. So Robert asked at the very beginning of this presentation that one could postulate that early explorers from Spain could use Muslim metaphors to refer to what they experienced in the Americas if they actually thought they had reached Asia. And I think you addressed this quite a bit, but he wondered if you could refresh our memory. When did Europeans actually realize that they had landed on new continents and not in Asia?
Right, good question. So it depends which Europeans you're talking about. So Columbus dies in 1506 and believes until the end of his life that he has reached Asia. He never, in any of his writings, claims otherwise. For him, the problem is simply finding the right route to the Grand Khan. Others, though, very, very quickly understand that they're not in Asia and that they're in new territory, quote unquote, new to them, obviously. So, you know, someone like Las Casas, who's a very famous writer of this period, you know, it's very clear that they have found new territory. The first written account, the first account written in a European language on American soil is written by someone who sails with Columbus on the second voyage, and even that person is very clear that this is a new place. And also, I didn't talk about it in this talk, but is another one of these writers who uses Islam as a kind of equivalence for understanding native societies.
Okay, a lot of really great questions coming in. People want to have a sense of the Muslim world's engagement with the New World. So Keating asked if Muslims sailed to the New World after Columbus, and Ray asked if you could say something about any Islamic reaction to Columbus's discovery in the New World. Were they aware of these voyages and the discovery of a quote unquote Western route to Asia?
Right. Okay, so great questions. You know, in this period, and might say for another, it depends on one's perspective, but for at least 100 years, let's say this immediate period, and throughout the 16th century, Muslim sailors never sailed to the Americas. The Ottomans, for example, never send a fleet across the Atlantic Ocean. They would be the most centrally located empire to do that, and they don't. And the reason I kind of hesitated at the beginning, there are enslaved West Africans who cross the Atlantic very early, who are Muslims. So in the 1520s, for example, in Hispaniola, you have a community of Wolof Muslims. And you know, they obviously didn't sail of their own volition, but are nevertheless important for understanding this early period of the Americas and of thinking about Islam in the Atlantic. But as far as a kind of official political expedition to explore, to gain territory, no Muslim state does that. In terms of the knowledge of the Atlantic voyages in the Ottoman Empire, let's say, again, the empire of closest proximity to Europe and the Mediterranean. Very, very early on, so at the end of the 1490s and in the first decade of the 16th century, maps from Columbus's voyages eventually make their way to the Ottoman Empire. And you have, in 1513, a very famous Ottoman map by someone named Piri Rais that survives and is composed of what he called from Italian, Spanish maps of the Americas. And this is one of the earliest renditions of what is today Brazil that we have. And so the Ottomans, through translation of both cartographic knowledge, but also some early, what we might think of as ethnographic materials, come to learn something about the Americas and are aware, of course, of the fact that Spain has found these new territories. But you know, the kind of larger point here is that you know, we might say, well, if the Ottomans were so powerful, why didn't they cross the Atlantic? And my answer to that is they didn't need to cross the Atlantic. They held territory on 3 continents. They were one of the largest states in the world in the 16th century. They're the ones who controlled trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world. And it's precisely because of that Spain and Portugal are looking for routes around the Muslim world. And so it's in some ways an act of desperation to cross the Atlantic, an act of desperation that the Ottomans don't need to undertake.
Okay, a lot of people asking questions about the treatment of the native people of the Americas and as perceived by Columbus. So, how did he perceive the people when he arrived there? Did he go to his grave sort of thinking that they were Moors, for example? And to what extent did the perception that these were Islamic people drive some of the brutality that you see in the treatment of the indigenous people by the Spaniards?
Yeah, great questions. So, Islam is just one of the filters that is used to understand the Americas by these early Europeans. I'm not claiming it's the only one. I'm not claiming it's exclusively what happens. In actual fact, these are snippets that come up every now and then, but are not the dominant way of understanding the Americas. Nevertheless, it is there, and it is a consistent theme for these early Spaniards of likening native peoples to the cultures of Islam in the Old World. And I think that that does allow them some license to treat native peoples as enemies, that they are somehow on a continuum of Islam and indigenous culture that is against Christianity, that is against Spanish culture, and is therefore part and parcel of the enemies that they're fighting against. It's a way of rationalizing them as other, which allows the Spaniards therefore to exercise violence against them.
Okay, I want to shift to the narratives around the Jewish populations in Spain, because there have been many questions that have come in on this topic. Everything from wondering whether or not Jews had any role in financing Columbus's expedition, to Sarah's question, Columbus's awareness of the status of Jews who were in 1492 were expelled from Spain, but before that were having serious problems in Spain. So I'll leave it at that, but I may follow up if I can get through a few of the other questions about Jews.
Right, great question. So, I didn't have time to do it here, but in my book I do. So if you're interested, please do check it out. But the other major event in 1492 connected to Spain is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So, and that is a part and parcel of the Reconquista, Isabella and Ferdinand's Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. So I can say a number of things here. One is the majority of the Jews who are expelled from Spain will eventually, not immediately, but eventually end up in the Ottoman Empire. This is the Sephardic community of the Ottoman Empire. And many of them will go to Istanbul, Constantinople. A large majority will go to the city of Salonika, what is today Thessaloniki in Greece. And Salonika becomes one of the largest Jewish cities in the world. It's one of the few cities between antiquity and the 20th century to have a Jewish plurality of its population. It becomes a center of Ladino culture, Ladino being the language of the Sephardim, the Jews who are expelled from Spain, of Hebrew culture. This means a printing press. This means scholars from all over the world coming to study in Salonika. So there's a deep connection between the Ottoman-Spanish rivalry and the Jews of Spain and the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of kind of mythology out there around was Columbus Jewish? There's no evidence to suggest that he was. There is some evidence that some of the properties that were seized from Jews after their expulsion did go into the coffers of the Spanish kingdoms, and some of that money was used to finance Columbus's voyages. So in that way, Jewish money did go to the Atlantic voyages, but not in a direct way. So there's a lot more I could say about that. And the other thing to say here is the difference between the Jews of Spain and the Muslims of Spain. It differs markedly in a number of ways. Just one I'll mention is for the Muslims of Spain, they are seen as much more of a political military threat to the Spanish than the Jews are. The Jews are seen as a cultural, theological, religious threat to Catholics. But because of the presence of enemy empires, enemy Muslim empires around the Mediterranean, the Muslims of Spain are thought to be a kind of fifth column element that could potentially align with these external political foes. There's no Jewish equivalent of that. There's no Jewish empire that might align with the Jews of Spain. So the Jews and Muslims of Spain, while both are the objects of Catholic violence, have a very different positionality within Catholic Iberia.
Okay, I want to give one follow-up question on this topic of Judaism and Islam from Wendy, who says, I'm an art historian and the importance of Islam at this time in European art is now coming into the fore. What do you think is driving these new historical realizations?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think for some, obviously not for everybody, but in a world in which what is it, 12% of France is Muslim. There are major Muslim populations across Europe. The sense of a multicultural Europe and what that looks like is something that people are grappling with, and inevitably historians are a part of that conversation. What has been the past of Muslims and Europeans in the realm of architecture and amongst art historians, in commerce, in interconfessional relations, in intellectual exchange, all of these kinds of things. So there is a lot, as the questioner is asking, there's a great deal of work now that is looking at some of the ways that Islam influenced European art, commerce, political thought, etc.
Okay, I want to move now to the hegemonic point of view, because there are many questions that are looking at this perspective from both enslaved people and indigenous people in the Americas. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is, looking at Africans that were brought across on these ships, to what extent does their being from areas where Islam was prevalent an influence in their participating in these journeys? Yeah,
great question, very important. Again, I have a chapter in my book on this. So in this very early period, so let's say from 1492 to 1525, okay, first 30 years, the Spanish authorities in Spain, and some in the New World too, eventually, are very worried about importing Islam to the Americas, right? As I talked about in the talk, there's a sense of wanting a new beginning in the New World, free of Islam. Why would we purposely import this old world enemy to the Caribbean? So, very, very early on in a place like Hispaniola, once plantations are set up, there's a labor shortage on those plantations. Indigenous people have either fled or died because of disease. And so a lot of the Spaniards who run these plantations need laborers. And so they're lobbying the crown to send them people to work on these estates. Now, the slave trade has been going for a very long time between North Africa and West Africa and Iberia. Places like Valencia are huge slave markets. And so the Spanish authorities, again, very worried about exporting Islam to the Americas, are very wary of sending some of these ex-Muslim slaves. So when slaves first came from North Africa and West Africa, no matter their religion, if they're Muslim or any other religion, they are forcibly converted to Catholicism, right? And they have to sort of prove their religiosity, that they're not just Catholics on the outside, but also Catholics on the inside. And anyone who knows anything about the Inquisition will know that a lot of the work of the Inquisition was in determining the true belief of professed Christians. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of religious quarantine that takes place. So some of these slaves, ex-Muslim slaves who are now Catholic, are sent across to be laborers on these plantations in Hispaniola. This works for a while, but as the plantations grow, people need more and more labor. There's more demand for labor on these plantations. And Spanish plantation owners lobby for the direct transshipment of people from West Africa to the Caribbean. So instead of going up to Spain, staying there for a couple of years, making sure you're a good Catholic, and then being sent, they want the direct shipment of people across the ocean. And it's during that period that many Muslims are sent across the ocean. So the same worry is there of sending Muslims to the Caribbean, and the crown resists this. They don't want this. They want people to come to Spain for the reasons that I cited. And so there are various negotiations back and forth. Sometimes the crown allows it, sometimes they bar it. And they specifically cite the notion that we're sending Muslim slaves to the Caribbean. This is something we don't want. Mm-hmm. See this then in Spanish accounts from plantations in places like Hispaniola and other islands, in which plantation owners will write, for example, there's a great account, I mean, great in the sense of it's very illuminating, of from a plantation owner who writes about the bad customs of Islam that his African slaves are teaching the Indians. So this is a person who has enslaved Africans and enslaved Indians working together on his plantation, and he writes that his African slaves are somehow teaching Islam to the indigenous people of the Americas, which is a kind of amazing thing to think about. So, you know, one of the ways this comes to a head is in 1521. There's an event known as the Christmas Day Revolt, in which a group of Wolof Muslim slaves on a plantation in Hispaniola attack the plantation owner and kill him, and then start raiding other plantations around, and the revolt is eventually put down. But this is cited by the crown as, aha, you see, we told you, we can't send Muslims because, you know, the Muslims are our enemies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is cited as an example of, this is what happens when you send Muslim slaves. You know, we have to work to prevent these kinds of people from being sent across the ocean.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And I can see just the depth of content that we have to go to your book to find, because there's just so many really interesting stories here, and enjoying the conversation that's taking place in the chat as well. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have about 30 questions still on the table. So if your question doesn't get answered, I encourage you, post it in the chat. There are a lot of really knowledgeable people there, and they may be able to provide some insight on your question. I want to go to Joe's question, because I think it's a direct follow-on to what you've just spoken about. He says, it's easy to accept your argument in favor of Islam as a motivation for Isabel de Castilla. However, I recall the long debate over the religious status of indigenous Americans. They are never referred to as Moros by de las Casas. The debate for almost 70 years is, are these people tabla rasa to be converted, as Isabel la Católica believed, or are they antagonists to be enslaved?
Sure. Yes. I mean, that debate does exist and continues. Yeah, I don't want to claim, and I hope it didn't come across that anyone truly believes that the indigenous peoples are Muslims. I don't think that's the case. I think it's using the language of Islam to try to describe, understand, assimilate native peoples to a worldview that makes sense to them.
Mhm.
using their knowledge of another culture to understand a new culture. I don't believe that any of them actually think that anyone in the Americas is Muslim, even if they think they're in Asia.
Yeah, just a really interesting point. Okay, I want to go to John, who says, "Thank you so much for the book. Those who haven't read it should hurry to do so."
Thank you.
While we can understand the motivation of the earliest Spanish explorers and the role of Islamic Christianity conflict in their undertaking, do we really believe that absent this motivation, the course of history in North America would be significantly different? And then he hits on, something that's been raised by other people, which is sort of putting this storyline in the context of British and other Northern European settlers. How do they fit into the new perspective that you've given us?
Right. So this is something also I touch on in the book. I think one could write, and my book doesn't do this, but one could write several books probably on the consistency of the presence of real life Muslims and the imagination of Islam in the Americas from 1492, as I argued today, up until today. And we could cite many examples. I'll give you a couple. So John Smith, the first colonial governor of Jamestown, he was a slave in the Ottoman Empire for 2 years before he ever crossed the ocean. Many of the early governors, many of the earliest British officials who eventually ended up in the American colonies had traveled around to various cities in the Ottoman Empire, Jerusalem, Damascus, Constantinople, Cairo. This was a common thing in a similar way that the Grand Tour was for Europeans. And so John Smith doesn't do that, but John Smith is a soldier fighting for various European states, and in a battle in what is today Romania, is captured by Ottoman forces and taken as a slave to the Ottoman Empire, where he stays for 2 years. He eventually is bought out, and his freedom is bought, and he goes back to England and eventually crosses and becomes governor of Jamestown. So that's a kind of interesting factoid. Why does that matter? Well, he does a very similar thing to Columbus. He describes some of the native peoples that he encounters as have something to do with the Muslim world. So he describes an Indian chief, for example, that his dress is very similar to the dress of a Turkish gentleman. He draws similar equivalences between native dancing and dancing that he saw in the Ottoman Empire. If you look at and I have a reproduction in the book, the very first British map of Virginia, the colony, has John Smith's seal on it as the governor. On his seal are the severed heads of 3 Turks. So there are 3, heads with turbans on his seal. And it was said that these are the heads of 3 Ottoman soldiers that he had killed during battle. So, that's a very clear indication of some of the relevance of thinking about this history for the history of the Americas. On the very first map of Virginia, we have, Ottoman soldiers, the severed heads of these 3 Turks. And there are numerous other examples that I could get into. The Barbary pirates, for example, that operate in the Eastern Atlantic are, a big thorn in the side of the British as they continually cross the Atlantic. So there's a piece that I teach that's great about a ship that's destined for New Haven that is captured by Barbary pirates and ransomed. It's not coincidental that America's first foreign war after it declares its independence is against the North African powers,
Mm.
the Barbary Wars. So again, there are many, many examples that one could give of continuities between the Muslim world and this earlier history of the Americas. But Columbus is obviously, just one piece of this.
Okay. And when we talk about the Muslim world, it's coming from quite a few people sort of wanting to tease out the differentiation of Muslims as perceived by the Italians or the Spanish or other Europeans, just noting that there is not a monolithic global Islam or Islamic alliance any more than there is a Christian one. And I want to point out just something that Chuck said, which is that he was a former Peace Corps volunteer in a majority Muslim country, Malaysia. And he said in reading your book, it explained to him why he was so embarrassed by his ignorance and prejudice against Muslims and Islam when he arrived, which was very much reversed by his experience living in Malaysia. So just really speaking to, this idea of a diversity in the Islamic world, and to what extent did the European explorers recognize and understand that, and how is that sort of impacted by their arrival in the New World?
Right. So
5 questions in one.
Okay. Yeah. Everyone is absolutely right. There's enormous diversity in the Muslim world. There are Muslims, I think, in every country in the world at this point.
I think it's one of the fastest growing religions in the world, actually.
Yeah, that's right. I believe Pew has a study in which they say that by 2070, Islam will be the largest religion in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to understand the history of the Muslim world, as problematic as that term is. But of course, there's enormous diversity in terms of religious belief, never mind culture and language and cuisine and history and all of the enormous, vast, even in my talk a little bit, you see, Wolof Muslims have very little in common with Muslims in Cairo or in Istanbul or Eastern Turkey or Iran. In terms of, did the Spanish conquistadors, that's an interesting question. So the sources we have, they use terms, the terms are very slippery. They talk about infidels, Moors, Saracens, Mohammedans is a derogatory term for speaking. And they kind of throw these around very loosely. So, these conquistadors are not the most sophisticated folks in the world, right? Forgive me. But they're not scholars. So we could say that in their conception, a Muslim's a Muslim to them. But of course, knowledge of Islam in Europe is in some ways much more sophisticated than is represented by these conquistadors. And there are many, the Quran has been translated into several languages at this point, etc. So there is a more nuanced understanding of Islam, that Turks and North Africans are fundamentally different, that Iran is different than other parts, etc. And of course, once Europeans enter into the Indian Ocean world in a major way, they'll come to understand Islam differently. Mm-hmm. Still, I do want to just note that I think in the European conception of the world in this period, Islam is a kind of bugaboo black box, right? There is a kind of collapsing of difference so that, all Muslims are enemy, right? Again, there's much more nuance there, but in very broad brushstrokes, that is the case.
All right, that's great. I think we're just coming up at the end of our time. And so before we finish, I wanted to give you the last word, Professor Mikhail, and say thank you on behalf of all of us from Yale Alumni Academy and all of our alumni. This has been a really lively discussion. We're still holding strong at about 300 plus people who've hung out with us to the end because there have been so many good questions. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Mikhail, for the final wrap up. Any last statements?
Okay, I just want to thank you all for spending some time, for listening, and for all your wonderful questions. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season.
Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you in the new year with more great Yale Alumni Academy lectures. Bye-bye.